Welcome to the Council for Parliament of the World's Religions webinar series. I'm Steve Perkins. I serve as the Senior Vice President of the Center for Neighborhood Technology, and I was on the board of the Council for about a dozen years and was its Vice Chair for a few of them. Following today's presentation, you'll have time for questions. You just fill out the little box on your screen, and we'll get as many questions answered as we can. Today's webinar is entitled Unexpected Diversity, Interfaith Organizing from the Bottom Up, and it features Matthew Weiner. Matthew Weiner has worked as an interfaith organizer for 20 years and now serves as Associate Dean of Religious Life at Princeton University. He served for 10 years as the Program Director of the renowned Interfaith Center of New York, where he developed a methodology for engaging religiously diverse communities throughout civil society, working with over 500 grassroots religious leaders, as well as the New York State Court System, the Public Library, Catholic Charities, New York Board of Rabbis, and the United Nations. He earned a Ph.D. from Union Theological Seminary, an M.T.S. from Harvard Divinity School, and has a B.A. from New York University. He writes about public religion, interfaith and civil society, and engaged Buddhism. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you, Steve, and greetings, everyone. And this is my first webinar, so I'm excited for it to be with the Parliament of World Religions, one of the really great interfaith organizations on the planet, and one that's done so much amazing work. And I'm going to speak for about 20 or 25 minutes, maybe less. I feel really odd giving a monologue to a screen when we're trying to talk about dialogue and interfaith. So I'm going to monologue for a little bit and then try to get us into a dialogue as soon as possible. And then I thought the way I would talk about the interfaith methodologies that we developed would be to do so through storytelling. So I'm going to tell basically the story of the experiments that I and my colleagues did at the Interfaith Center of New York starting in 1996. And I want to point out before I get into the stories that for us, both when we started and still today, even though we're all in different places, interfaith is necessarily experimental, and I think experimental first. And by that I mean most of you who are interested in interfaith are interested in interfaith dialogue or interested as theologians or activists as organizers, but as experimenters, we have to think of ourselves as experimenters because interfaith is a new field. Anyone who thinks that they can talk about it as if it is something kind of finished and done and we know how to do it is doing it at least differently than we would do it in terms of thinking as experimenters as we go, reflecting as we go. And every time I give any kind of presentation about interfaith, I find that it's different than the one I gave before because there have been a lot of experiments that have gone on in between. So that's enough on that. But in some ways, that summarizes the kind of main idea that I want to get across as we go. So just to kind of quickly give some background and nods to mentors, the very Reverend James Parks Morton, who is the Dean of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, was our kind of founder of the Interfaith Center. And he started doing interfaith work in the mid-70s when it was undoubtedly extremely experimental. The first work that he did was bringing Shinto priests into the Cathedral of St. John and having them do liturgical work in there. He brought the Dalai Lama to the cathedral in the mid-70s, got him in a lot of trouble back in those days, bringing Native Americans into the cathedral, basically with the idea that a cathedral is a space for everyone, even if it's a Christian space, and then therefore that means every other kind of religion. Want to start with that because at the time, again in the mid-70s, this was kind of radical, liberal, creative, path-breaking behavior. And you can look now and think, well, interfaith is something a lot of people are doing and trying to figure out how to do. When Jim Morton was doing it, it was totally prophetic. When he retired in 1996, he started something called the Interfaith Center of New York. And the idea of the Interfaith Center was to bring together all the religiously diverse communities in New York and have them interact with each other. So my colleagues and I were hired and basically tasked with bringing together the diversity of the city. And so that's what we tried to do. New York is a fun place to do that. We have Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Native Americans, Shintos, Afro-Caribbean religious groups. And then within each of those groups, we found very quickly that there were many, many, many subgroups. So just as an example, if we're talking about Buddhists, we can't just have one Buddhist leader. We have to have Korean, Sri Lankan, Cambodian, Thai, Burmese, so on and so forth. And then just to point out as we go, when we're talking about diversity, we can't represent any one religious community with any one person, because that person is going to be from one of the many different kinds or facets of that particular faith. So that was a kind of quick lesson, and not such an easy lesson, but something important to note. And then the second lesson that really came was, gosh, it looked like we had all of the faiths, and in fact many of the different facets of the faiths in terms of doctrine and location, but what we were missing was that everyone who was coming were people interested in interfaith per se. And what that meant was they were theologically liberal, and they're almost always politically liberal as well. And in fact, probably most of the people listening to this who are interested in interfaith tend to be liberal. So that's okay. We were and are liberal too. But the problem is, if we're going to do interfaith, and if we're looking to really bring together diversity, and if our extreme religious diversity is actually politically and theologically very similar and very much to the left, then we're having a really small conversation, even though we're talking about a movement and talking about diversity. So my colleagues and I started to invite more conservative religious leaders, and they didn't come. Or they'd come once and they wouldn't come back. Or they'd be too busy. Maybe they weren't conservative, but they were just grassroots religious leaders who have 100 phone calls a day with real-life problems within their community. And then this made us notice also that not only were the people who would come to programs people who had time for dialogue and liberal, but also just people who had the time. And so we thought a lot about this problem and tried to figure out how to solve it. And that, just as a note for a second, meant a lot of going out and meeting religious leaders and spending time with them, spending hundreds and hundreds of hours, going and speaking with religious leaders, and this led us towards grassroots religious leaders, and I'll get to that in a second. And what it meant was really getting to know the community of people, not just setting up a framework that was our framework, but speaking to a lot of religious leaders and hearing what their issues were and what could interest them, and this began to shape the way that we thought about what interfaith should be. And it led us to basically, to make a long story short, creating programs around practical issues. Practical issues meaning issues like domestic violence, hate crimes, immigration rights, issues that any grassroots religious leader, no matter where they would fit on the spectrum, would be finding this problem and facing it and having problems with it. An early example for us was we did a retreat on immigration, and a Buddhist monk from Chinatown named Reverend Tongsa, who had been a good friend and who had never come to anything but suddenly showed up at this program, and I asked him why. And he said, well, I was interested in the other stuff, but I didn't have time. But actually, you know, I'm a Buddhist monk and I know a lot about Buddhism, but I get asked about green cards every day because my community trusts me, but I don't know anything about green cards. So that's why I'm on this bus going to this retreat. So the point is that religious leaders who may be conservative, may be just too busy to be interested in interfaith dialogue, would come to programs that we started to design about these social issues. So I just want to say it kind of reconfigured entirely who was coming to our programs. First of all, it made it much, much more grassroots. The people who were coming were people who have all these problems very directly. Secondly, it was entirely the full range of the political and theological spectrum. Hasidic rabbis were there, Black Baptists were there, conservative Chinese Buddhist monks were there. And people were coming because they wanted to learn about this topic, and bring information back to their community and help their community. So we were helping them in that way and empowering them in that way. But they did it alongside religious leaders from other faiths, so they were meeting people from other religions. And actually they'd end up learning a lot about each other, but instead of it being in an official dialogue format, they learned about each other by asking questions and by explaining their situations. So they learned about each other's faith quite naturally as fellow kind of parallel grassroots religious leaders. And then religious leaders would start to partner on their own. They realize, hey, we're in the same neighborhood, or we're concerned about this particular topic, hate crimes, green cards, whatever. Let's partner together about it. It wasn't about being religiously different per se. It was about having a shared problem. And then that was one way that organic programming would come out, or organic partnerships and organic programming would build up and out of that. They would do it on their own. We would listen to them and design programming based on what we would hear and how we would see them working together. And then, of course, in more dramatic cases, things like 9/11 would happen, or the Bombay, the Bombay massacre that happened a couple of years ago. When things like that happen, suddenly all these religious leaders who would not have partnered together or would not have stood together defiantly if we had called them and they didn't know each other, or if we had said, hey, you guys should all know each other so that when a crisis happens. No, they wouldn't have done that. But meanwhile, they've all kind of gotten to know each other through regular practical programming that's helpful for them for their regular community. So those are some of the ways that kind of organic programming develops. And I want to point out when I use the word organic, I think the title of this presentation is bottom up. What I mean by that is a couple of different things. We would have a topic such as domestic violence, hate crimes, immigration. That would be our topic. But then how are we going to run the actual program, and what's the program going to look like? Well, I might be interested in one of those topics in a particular way. I might want everyone to do A, B, or C, but that's not what the religious leaders want, right? So instead, what we would do is we would have a topic based on listening a lot to what religious leaders' concerns were, but then in terms of designing the program itself, we would also go back and invite them to come to the program and have them think carefully about what are the issues or how would they want the program to actually develop. So the program, I don't want to say it happens purely democratically, that's not true, but it very much happens organically and with a lot of listening and a lot of time, attention to the people who will be there. So that's one way that the program is organic. The second way the program is organic is that once the program is actually happening, let's say we're having a program in the Bronx about hate crimes with the assistant DA in the Bronx. The program is about the definitions of a hate crime. But then when the religious leaders start explaining their particular issues and the DAs start talking, the next thing you know, they develop their own idea for an ongoing workshop or an ongoing task force. So the programs that we develop, I want to use this term, are kind of frameworks. When we create a program, it is a real life program that really creates interfaith dialogue and develops religious leaders for their community. But it's also a framework that allows religious leaders to think together and work together and develop new programming. And in our opinion, the best programming that happens is the programs that come up and out of the programs that we develop. Quite often, what ends up happening is the program gets developed and 3 years later we hear about it because we're not in control of the religious leaders, nor do we want them to, nor do we want to be, right? The religious leaders are leaders in their own right. By creating a framework model or a kind of environmental model, what we do is we put them as leaders in positions to lead and to develop their programs as they like. So, you know, when we did this and when we suddenly had all kinds of much more conservative religious leaders, we built a network of about 500 or so religious leaders. When we did that, all kinds of assumptions were challenged. The first thing is that we realized that we thought we knew what interfaith should look like and that we should bring people who would fit that. Or we should get people who didn't fit it but would fit into it the way we wanted them to be. We thought we knew both what the program should look like and what the outcomes should be. There should, there should be dialogue and learning in a particular way. The people who come should be interested in it that way. People who are more politically or theologically conservative, once they join, they would transform to be more liberal theologically, right? Because that's what probably most people on this call, including myself, would hope for. We'd hope for a kind of greater tolerance, a building of kind of liberal theology towards each other's religions. And we were really challenged by that because even though we were first excited that we could get a lot of conservative religious leaders to come, and then when they came, they would do all kinds of great work with each other and with other religious leaders, but they didn't suddenly become nice liberals, theologically or politically. And so just to give a couple examples of that specifically, Sheikh Musa Jamluk, who's a Senegalese Muslim leader in the Bronx, he is extremely conservative, theologically speaking. And yet he, when we met him, had started a school for Muslim students that was really about turning them into good citizens. He also had a food program. And then he started doing a lot of amazing work with a Jewish school, his Muslim students and Jewish students having a regular partnership together. And throughout all this time, he remained theologically conservative, pretty conservative on sexual orientation, and that didn't change. So that leads someone like me to a question. What do we do about people who we hope would change, but we want them involved in the interfaith dialogue? And we'll come back to this, but this is a kind of a puzzle, I think, for us. Another example is another friend, Rabbi Manny Weiser. He's a Hasidic rabbi from Williamsburg, Satmar, one of the most kind of Orthodox groups you can possibly imagine. And when I first went and met with Manny, I asked him if he would join some interfaith dialogue groups, and he went on about how absolutely terrible interfaith was. It was just kind of like a bad thing, and how even if he didn't think it was a bad thing, he could not do it from his position of orthodoxy. He's not allowed to engage in dialogue or spiritual exploration around religion. It's against his understanding of orthodoxy. So I kind of gave up. And then we talked about something else. And then he said, by the way, do you know my friend Bishop Mercado? And Bishop Mercado, he then went on to explain, is a Latino Pentecostal bishop who's also there in Williamsburg. Well, you have to meet my good friend Bishop Mercado. We do all kinds of great work together. Okay, so what's going on here? Obviously, from Rabbi Manny's perspective, what he's doing with Bishop Mercado is not interfaith dialogue. It's a partnership between the Hasidic community and the Latino Pentecostal community. It's there to create safety between the two communities, and they can advocate together. They are friends, and he calls them friends. If he thought it was interfaith dialogue and theologically driven conversation, he wouldn't be able to do it. So fine, let's call it something else. And this example and some of these other examples helped us kind of earlier on to realize, right, we're called the Interfaith Center, but we're having a program about X, and the people who are coming to the program are from religiously diverse backgrounds, and they're going to explain why they're there, and the social needs that bring them there, and the moral framework that allows them to do the work they do. But some of them aren't going to come if they think it's about learning about each other's religion. So Manny was a good example of that for me. And then just another kind of funny example. When I got to know Manny better and then finally convinced him to come to a retreat that we were doing, in this case it was about domestic violence, and there's a lot of domestic violence in every community and also in the Hasidic community, they were really interested to come. One of the reasons they were interested to come, and this is a good kind of lesson just to note, is that they couldn't really talk or think very well about this topic within their community because it was so taboo, but to leave their community and to talk about it completely off-site with people from other religions was something that they could do. And that's just a kind of side lesson. But when Rabbi Manny said, well, have any other Hasidic rabbis ever come to this? And I said, no, we wouldn't think they would want to come. And he said, well, why not? And I said, well, I just assumed that you guys would be scared of, someone trying to evangelize you or trying to get, someone would try to convert you or something, and that'd be a reason why you wouldn't want to come. And he, he had this kind of funny response, which was something like, look, some people there, maybe they'll try to convert us, they're going to fail, and then we're going to get down to business. So the point is, I think that we make assumptions about interfaith dialogue like, oh, it has to be safe. There can't be people there who are trying to convert each other. We have to all have respect for each other in a particular kind of way that we were assuming. And someone like Rabbi Manny, he could care less about that. And in fact, when he meets up with Sheikh Drumma, they kind of recognize each other's conservative nature. Sheikh Drumma is very comfortable saying, yeah, I think my religion's the best, and you should probably think your religion's the best too, otherwise you'd be something else. So, maybe it's an urban setting, or maybe it's just getting down to kind of practical things, but a lot of these cases are things that kind of taught me anyway. Other ways about thinking about interfaith that can kind of break the assumptions that we make, which I think limit who can come, which is ultimately the goal, to widen who can come. And then as we're widening who comes, to reconfigure and rethink, well, what are our goals? And were our goals too much our own goals and not the goals of the people that we were trying to facilitate and work with? And we could change our goals based on that. So then that whole kind of line of programming, and by that I mean programming about practical social issues, was quite successful. And then as we were doing them, we started to notice something else. And by the way, I should say, whenever we're doing any programming, as I said, it's an experiment. And because it's an experiment, we're paying attention to how it's happening and how we can do it different and what else we're learning as we're going. And like with any experiment, the more times you see a particular trend, you start to pick up. So what we started to notice was the secular experts who would come in and lead these workshops on immigration, on different social issues. At the end of the program, they would come up to us and say, oh, gee, I'm an immigration specialist and I do all kinds of advocacy work in Chinatown. I guess I should learn something about the Buddhist monks down there, what Buddhism has to say if I want to reach out to that community. Or some other, or a different, we would be working in the court system and judges would say, oh, gee, we live in Queens, but all the judges are Jewish, secular, or Christian. And yet Queens is the most religiously diverse place in the world. We should actually know something about the faiths of these communities we're working around. So that led us to a kind of aha moment, which was that the secular world, and by that I mean secular agencies, secular nonprofits, secular activists, and city agencies as well, they're doing work in communities that are immigrant communities, poor communities. Those communities are predominantly religious. And the social moral role that religion plays in those communities is hugely important for their work. And yet, across the board, they have no training about religion, religious diversity, the social role religion plays, none of it. And so when we started to see this, we started to investigate 9 social work schools in New York City. All of them require diversity training. None of them touch upon religion. And so on and so forth. I don't need to really go into detail. Any city agency that deals with any topic of concern, that knowing the religious communities around you would help you do your work, knowing them and understanding how they do their work, none of them had any background in this whatsoever. So we decided that to do this, we wanted to create some kind of religious diversity training, and that the way we would do it would be to have the very religious leaders who were getting trained to now become the faculty and to train the social workers, the judges, the school teachers, the activists for a particular cause. And we would have them not provide kind of information about Buddhism like the Four Noble Truths or so on and so forth, but instead, I'm a Buddhist monk, I live in Queens, this is what my community is like, this is what I do for my community, this is how I do it as a Buddhist leader, so on for Christianity, so on. And then also in each case, we would make a point of having the programs show the diversity within the faith. Because once again, the worst thing you could do is teach a social worker that there's one kind of Islam or one kind of Judaism, and obviously that's not true, getting back to what we were saying in the beginning. So this kind of religious diversity training for the secular public, let's call it that, became a very important kind of second piece. And I'll use the term kind of a way to kind of create reciprocal education between the religious leaders who are learning from each other as they're learning about a topic through a secular agency, and then those very religious leaders educating that secular agency or that activist from that particular topic. And as they're doing it, also learning about each other. So I want to say again that the education, and there's any number of ways that we would do it, would be religiously diverse groups learning about each other as they're learning about a topic of shared concern, as they're teaching the experts from within that topic about who they are and what they do. And so then that makes it both educational but also civic, right? Because they're all learning about each other, but they're creating a network. So it's educational, but it's civic. They're building civil society as they're doing it. And if we think of religious communities as part of the overlapping public that makes up what we call civil society, then interfaith is a form of civil society, but it's also changing it and fostering it and adding diversity to it. That's almost the end of what I wanted to say. The last thing I wanted to say is that I think I focused a bit here on, I think we tend to think of interfaith as something super cutting edge and kind of subversive against larger structures. And I guess what I've been arguing up till now is that the way that we've been thinking about interfaith quite often is unfortunately not that. It might be building a movement, but it's very limited. And what I'm trying to argue is that to be subversive against our assumptions, we have to widen interfaith, put in a lot more of ways and frameworks to create a wider internal group. But then I also want to say, just in case I came across as being too conservative myself, which I'm not, is that I think that the act of interfaith itself can be subversive, and it's subversive not when you're trying to be a kind of cool, powerful activist, but instead when you just very simply say something like, oh, gee, we're going to have a panel of 3 Muslims, and they're going to be speaking to the court system. One of those panelists should be a woman leader. Yeah, she's not a clergy person, but there are different kinds of leaders within the community, and there are certainly have to be some Muslim women out there somewhere, so let's put a woman on the panel. Now, actually, when we tried to do that 15 years ago, we got a lot of pushback. But what ends up happening when you put people who would ordinarily not be seen as leaders, so I've used the case of women, but we can think of any other, we can think of lay leaders in general. But when you put people who would not be considered leaders in positions to speak as leaders, it changes who they are in the community itself. And this is something that, again, took us a long time to see, but both in the case of Muslim women, I'm thinking of some particular cases, and in the case of Buddhist nuns, we found that by having them speak on panels or by giving them roles that perhaps other leaders within the community would not have given them, and simply saying that we were doing it because we wanted to make sure to have the representation there, it began to change the power dynamics and who they are in the community. Other people would invite them to serve as leaders in other contexts. All kinds of amazing stories around that. So just quickly in summary, if we really want to develop interfaith, we have to experiment. And if we really are experimenting, we don't exactly know where we're going to go. We have to be open to changing our sense of where we want the whole picture to go. I think that, you know, that's a real challenge. So I want to kind of just summarize by saying, if we keep challenging ourselves by saying, who is it that's not here? How do we get them here? What do we have to change to get them here? And then what happens then? And looking at it then. And then also remaining intimate with the people that you work with. The bigger an interfaith organization gets, the less time you spend having a 3 or 4 hour conversation with Sheikh Drama up in the Bronx. The more you kind of think you know what he's thinking. But that was 3 years ago. And so I want to argue for those of you interested in interfaith, sure, write about it, speak about it, but make sure you spend a lot of time out there talking and having casual conversation, which doesn't instantly lead to a big successful program, but leads to your knowledge of how people actually work. You have your finger on the pulse of your friends and what you can do for them. So remaining intimate, and then you know, in the last 20 years, if I've run 1,000 interfaith programs, I'd say 700 of them weren't so great. And that's the reality of science. That's the reality of being a scientist, and by a scientist I mean being someone who's experimenting. We're in a funny world where we're always trying to write articles or get grants or be motivational speakers, but when we do that, we don't necessarily have time for running programs that may fail and may not be so good, and then spending a lot of time thinking about that and being excited to see what didn't work, why didn't these people come, what you know, that kind of thing. So I think I've talked for a full 10 minutes longer than I thought I would. So that's all from me. Looking forward to questions.
That was fantastic, Matt. I want to apologize to people who've sent in questions that don't get answered because we won't have a lot of time. But let me just begin by commenting that you've been working in one of the great cosmopolitan cities of the world, but many of the people on this call are come from places that are much smaller, even rural, and from places that are much less cosmopolitan. So one question that came in asked for advice about organizing in small towns and rural areas, and another one asked, what about doing it in environments that are hostile to interreligious or antagonistic to it?
I think, let me answer the first part first. I just myself moved to Princeton, New Jersey, and so, you know, it's interesting. I think the first thing I'd ask is the place that you're living really not so diverse? And how do you know that it isn't? So all you need really are two religious groups, interfaith. That's funny. But you know, a downside of having the kind of diversity we have in New York is that to be inclusive, we have to include hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different facets of different faiths. The good news about being in a less diverse setting is as long as you have two, you can do interfaith. That's the first thing I'd say. And then also, I bet your situation is more diverse than you think it is, even than it was 5 years ago. Half of my students here at Princeton are from non-city centers in New York City, and a huge number of them are from, their parents are first-generation immigrants. And they are the first set of people from their religion in the town that they're living in. So I would just be surprised if it's really not that diverse. And even if it isn't, that's great. Let it be just a couple of different religious groups. In terms of working in settings that are hostile to interfaith, when we talk about interfaith in the way that I've been talking about it, and by that I mean a kind of civil society model. Civil society is good for preventing conflict. It's not so hot for solving conflict or stopping it. But what I'd suggest is, in a sense, doing what I said at the beginning, which is, yeah, don't call it interfaith. Call it something else. Focus on a social issue that you think is going to be of paramount importance to the people on that street. Maybe it's a broken light, street light. Don't call it an interfaith coalition to fix the broken street light. Say, hey, we need to fix the street light. Let's get everyone together. A huge amount of really good interfaith happens without anyone even knowing that it's interfaith or is interfaith. Chan Jamuna, who's a Hindu leader in Queens, started what I call interfaith when her kids were being bullied. They were a new immigrant community in Queens. Her kids were getting bullied. The new Muslim kids were also getting bullied. The Jewish kids weren't getting bullied, but they had gotten bullied 30 years before, so the Jewish community was into being helpful. And the next thing you know, they had a coalition that they worked with the police on, and no one ever called it interfaith. That was, you know, that was in the early 80s. So I come by and I explain what I'm doing, and she says, oh yeah, I guess we did that, but we didn't call it interfaith. So that will be my strategy. Be creative about what you call it, but find, religious communities and religious leaders are the people who have social, moral frameworks and values for getting things done. And so they'll want to get something done if it's something important to them. You just don't want to put the barrier of calling it interfaith in the way.
Helpful, helpful. So when people get together in the programs that you run, I presume that they're focused, as you've described it, on an issue of shared concern. They do a lot of talking. Do they do anything else? I mean, there's a question here that says, what's the role of the arts or film or music or drama in this? Or is it all people talking to each other?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the particular programs that I've mentioned, people are talking to each other, and then they're going and doing things with each other. So I don't want to make it sound like it's purely biological. It's really not. It's dialogical about action, so it's kind of, to use this philosopher Habermas's term, it's communicative action. It's action and communication together. But that's the particular kind of interfaith that I've been talking about. Now, the founder of the Interfaith Center, Jim Morton, did a huge amount of interfaith around the arts and music and dance. I'm a big fan of that kind of work. That tends not to be the kind of work that you're going to get non-interfaith, non-liberal types to come to. So the reason we moved away from it, and again, when I was at the Interfaith Center, where I no longer am, by the way, I should point out that I'm now at Princeton University, but the reason the Interfaith Center moved away from it was we had all the people who wanted to do that kind of thing. We were trying to get another set of people. I think that that interfaith through the arts and music and dance is a tremendous way to get interfaith to happen. And it's a great way for people who aren't necessarily, want to communicate about their faith, but not through kind of intellectual means. Anyway, I think it's great. It's just, it tends to lean towards the people who already love doing that, which is great. The point of this particular talk that I've given is to point us towards the stuff that might get us new audiences. The last thing I want to say about that is that there have been times where we've done art workshops with our religious leaders and with the conservatives. It was just like a little, like a kind of a half an hour or an hour at the end of a panel or something, and that was always really beautiful. So I think it's a great way to do it.
Let's talk a minute about the intersection between interfaith and politics. Did you organize people to take on, for instance, an issue at the New York State Legislature, or is that not something that you recommend that interfaith groups do?
I don't recommend or not recommend it. I think it's a great thing to do. We have done a little bit of that. The way we tend to do it, though, at the Interfaith Center was not doing that, but then a particular case comes up or a particular issue comes up, like hunger or immigration rights, and at that point, the coalition that you've built, that wasn't a coalition to begin with, it was just a network of religious leaders that are working together and learning together. Suddenly you can kind of stimulate that group and say, hey, what about immigration rights? And then the immigration task force is created, and it was. So I think this gets back to the question of, is your interfaith work going to be framework-based or advocacy-based? I've been talking about it primarily from the position of a framework approach. And then the reason for that is if it's going to be bottom-up, then you create a framework, and then the people decide they want to do something together, or you suggest to them that they do something. And then those
I don't think it's clear to people what a framework is, because I have a question asking just exactly that question.
Yeah, good question. Okay, so I think we could use the term framework or environment. And what I'm trying to get at is, instead of saying, okay, let's create an I want to advocate for immigration rights. I'm going to go and meet, and I know what I want this, and we're going to put it together a declaration signed by 100 religious leaders, and this is what it's going to say. Now I'm going to go out and meet 100 religious leaders and get them to sign this. That would be an advocacy approach. Of course, I'm simplifying. Mm-hmm. I recognize that. A framework approach would be to say, hey, immigration and immigrant communities are facing all kinds of problems. Let's run a program that helps religious leaders learn about the problems around immigration. Let's make sure a lot of those religious leaders are immigrants themselves, and some aren't. And let's bring in a bunch of experts on immigration. And then let's have them all kind of work and think together. We don't have an advocacy outcome. We've created a framework. We've created a framework with a topic, with experts, and with people that we select, religious leaders and experts, and then we guide it, but we guide it very loosely. I guess it's trying to create an environment that allows the people that you've put in the environment to develop their own ideas and their own work with a little bit of guidance from you, but not with you leading from the front. I guess it's like almost like a leading from the back kind of approach. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's a moral. If we think about interfaith as a moral action, one way to do that kind of moral action is through advocacy, and another way is by creating a space for it to happen where you are not leading it per se. You're creating a space for people to lead themselves. It's a little more democratic, right? In terms of not democracy like voting, but democracy like citizenship, people working together and thinking together. I'm not sure if I'm being articulate enough about it.
No, I think that's clear. I mean, I think in the world of secular organizing, that is also a well-respected style where you spend a lot of time listening, and that the so-called organizer it involves people but stays in the rear, and successes when leaders emerge, or when people who were already leaders acknowledge that fact and step forward and grow and are able to be more effective.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then just to add, it's making the choice that the grassroots religious communities, once they're educated about something, actually know best for themselves, better than I would know what they should be doing.
Mm-hmm. So you've had a lot of people go to workshops and then go back to their communities, and the process of translating what happens in what for many of them will be a pretty unusual environment back to talking about to the average people in their communities can be a challenge. Do you ever address that directly in workshops? Or do you have any advice for people who are participating in this kind of organizing about taking the learnings or the ideas or the experience back home?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question, and I don't have any good answer. We don't, in the past, the Interfaith Center has not done specific work around that. I think that the basic idea is to think, how do you as a leader to come to this kind of workshop, and are they the kind of person who can bring this information back? And so part of it is our choosing. Part of it is getting feedback from the religious leaders about how it's working. But the question is a good question, and the information that we end up getting is very anecdotal. So I don't think there's any good system or good way to do it. I also think that in some cases it's religious leader X learns about a bunch of this and then gives a sermon. In other cases, religious leader X learns about all these things, doesn't do anything, and then someone in their community says something bad about the neighboring community. And says, actually, well, yeah, I met a bunch of people from that religion, and they're just fine, and I met them at this workshop. And so I think it's the kind of information that can can be directly brought back, but also kind of lives in the community or in the religious leader themselves. But it's a good question. I would just add one more thing to that, which is one of our real reasons in the past for not only dealing with clergy per se, or a religious leader per community per se, is precisely this thing. The clergy person may take the information and forget about it. So great. So then in that case, it means we should be having a couple of lay leaders in there who are more directly dealing with that particular topic or something like that. So I think strategically speaking, one of the ways of dealing with it is having more than one leader per community come and continuing to think that out. It's a good question, though.
You know, one of the criticisms that I hear of interreligious organizing from certain people is that it is pushing implicitly for a lowest common denominator religion or a syncretistic outcome, and that it undermines the purity of my faith. And so you've talked about that a little bit with respect to the Hasidic rabbi who wouldn't or couldn't participate in interreligious dialogue if that's what it was about. But have you run across this claim, this notion that it's promoting syncretism and more Orthodox people should stay away for that reason?
Yeah, we run around. I think that probably everybody who is engaged in interfaith runs across this problem all the time. And of course, part of the problem is that a lot of, I guess what I was trying to argue earlier, is a lot of interfaith programs, whether they know it or not, do make the assumption that that's what people should be doing. In other words, probably almost anybody who's an interfaith organizer would not say that. But actually, the frameworks, sorry, not the frameworks, I'll confuse people. The programs tend to be created in a way that does make an assumption that things should go in that direction. That's kind of what I've been arguing this whole time. What I'd say is that that isn't what happens. I can think of dozens of religious leaders who say that interfaith work helps clarify their identity as opposed to kind of mushing it together with other people's religion. I hear that both from liberal religious leaders and from conservative religious leaders. So I think people can kind of come into it thinking, oh, this is going to blur my lines, and they tend to come out saying no, because the point of interfaith encounter is to articulate where you come from. And so it's to encounter the difference and to be different. That's what interfaith is, to encounter the difference and to be different. And so so what I've tended to notice is that conservative religious leaders actually get that very easily and are kind of happy to kind of get interfaith when they get it, because they get to be themselves and be their conservative selves, and that's just fine. In some ways, it's the more liberal religious leaders that don't quite realize it going in, but then when they do go, and they tend to, in my experience, see that it, in a sense, reifies or reaffirms their own identity. So I think that I think it's overall a misconception that that's what interfaith would do. I think that quite often the programs that people design are set up in a way in which people would be scared of it in that way.
Mm-hmm. I do think that there are a lot of people in the movement who have a hope that we'll all be singing from the same hymnal by the end of the workshop or the end of their lifetime, and I think it's I appreciate your articulation of a very different perspective. Let's switch gears for a minute. We don't have a lot of time, but talk about how you related to the media. You know, you're in an environment in New York, or you were there, where many of the conflicts between groups played out in the media in all kinds of ways. How, as an interreligious organizer, how did you relate to all that?
Oh, I don't know how to talk about it so well without just immediately getting cynical and frustrated. So let me try to start with some optimistic sides. There are a lot of really interesting religious stories, and we were able quite often to connect journalists to really interesting and powerful stories. If there's a way to kind of guide listeners to some of those cases after this, the Interfaith Center's website, we can work on that. So I think that on the positive side, all kinds of really good interfaith stories. A Bangladeshi Buddhist group that worked closely with the Jewish Community Relations Council over years. The Jewish Community Relations Council ended up being very helpful to that Bangladeshi Buddhist group around a particular tragedy, and the Times picked that up in a really wonderful way. And kind of really good stories like that. I think that the negative thing, without getting into details, would just be to say that it's remarkable and very sad how different religious groups can build up deep partnerships and build up a lot of social capital, really a lot of trust with each other, and get to know each other. And then media can break that down very quickly. The media would be, whoever the journalists are who are writing, who don't know the people on the ground at all. So I'm thinking of a couple of famous cases, both the case of Debbie Almontazer a bunch of years ago with the Arabic school in Brooklyn, and then the Muslim Community Center near Ground Zero. In both of these cases, I could name dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of people different religious communities who were all connected to those two individuals, who ended up getting attacked in the media. And the fact that nobody in the media knew them personally had didn't stop the media from doing what it was doing, and and all the deep relationships that had been built did not protect the people who were hurt. And that's just a kind of a sad thing, that interfaith can develop amazing partnerships and do amazing work. And part of the reason it's so amazing is because of the trust that's built by people who know each other. And then a negative side of bad media is the people doing the writing or the people doing the broadcasting don't know the people there, but they can still have this very negative effect. And that's sad, and there's probably enough time on that.
Do you think interfaith should have a voice in the media, or is the voice the specific people in their own traditions?
I guess I think that in a broad sense, interfaith should have a voice. In both of these cases, there were a lot of religious leaders from other traditions who were supportive, and so I think a short answer to that would be yes.
Mm-hmm. A related question is, to what extent did you use social media in your organizing, and what insights do you have about it and its limitations, both by class or culture or whatever?
I'll just focus on limitations. I think that really good interfaith work happens when you're willing to go into a shul or a mosque or a temple and just spend a lot of time hanging out with people and getting to know them. And of course, social media has all kinds of very positive effects. What I'm thinking of is the negative effect as an interfaith organizer per se, is the amount of time you might spend writing blogs or sending Twitters or whatever. That's all great. That builds up a nice big following, and a lot of people hear about you and what you're doing, and that's great. That builds the movement. But if you don't spend time actually hanging out with the people themselves, it's just going to be a really different thing. The social capital is not going to be built in the same way. So not to be a curmudgeon about it, but because there's obviously good parts about it. I'm just focusing on what gets lost.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And talk about your organizing with youth.
The Interfaith Center of New York, since I have left, has done some really good work and the Interfaith Center should talk about it, not me, but with youth organizing, both in terms of some mediation training with youth, as well as with debate, teaching students how to debate around a topic across religious lines and around topics of shared concern. So they've done really good work on that. And then since September, I myself have been here at Princeton and I've just started to learn how students here are doing interfaith work. So I'm probably a little too early to talk about it much.
If you were in, let's say, Peoria, just to pick a place near Chicago, and you had a few friends who shared some concerns about the relationships between, say, Christians and Muslims and Sikhs, for example, in this community. What would be the first 2 or 3 things that you would do, that you'd recommend that they do?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing I'd do is ask a bunch of questions to find out what they were concerned about. If the idea was to try to, I'm not sure the way you phrased the question, but I think
it's really a startup question. You know, I'm new to this game. You know, I know my own religion. I don't know so much about others, but I do share this concern. What's the roadmap here?
Yeah, I think that you just have to go out and start to meet the people, the players that from the different faiths, and the players don't have to be the religious leaders. They can be lay leaders or just people in the community, and your excuse for meeting them, you have to have some excuse probably, right? You can't just say, hey, I want to be your friend, and you guys are having problems with each other. Or you can do it that way.
I think that wouldn't be such a great way to begin.
Yeah, right. So I mean, I think that, you know, I think that a good way to do it is to start talking to people, get an early sense of something that they would find as a shared concern. Start going and talking to them, learning what their issues are in general, what kind of problems they face in general. How they respond to those problems in general, and then this problem in particular, is this something of interest to you? Would you be interested in working on this issue? Who else do you know in your community that might be interested in this issue? Always leave a meeting like that with the name of 3 other people in your community, in that person's community, so that you have more people to go and talk with. And then as you're asking all those questions and having casual conversation, I mean, I think that casual conversation, building up friendships with the people you're talking to, so that a lot of the conversation is really casual, leads to actually getting a sense of what people are really interested in and what they care about. And as you do that, after you meet 3 people, 10 people, 20 people, you start to see, aha, if we had a workshop about this, a lot of these people would come. Now I'm going to go back and talk to them about this workshop and tell them about it, and ask them for their advice about how to shape it, and then continue to shape it and continue to ask questions and continue to meet new people. And the next thing you know, you have an interfaith program.
Matt, this has been wonderful. I really appreciate your spending this time with us, and I really honor this beginner's mind and the importance of listening and becoming ever more self-conscious about the assumptions that we bring to it, and the desire to control, and being open to what is needed by the situation or what's emergent. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. We hope that people on this webinar will join us for future ones. They happen every month, and you can learn about them at the Parliament website, parliamentoforganizations.org. And we assume that you're either part of or want to be part of the interreligious movement. We recommend that you join our social network, peacenext.org. There are people in your community that are already on it that you may want to connect to, and people who have concerns like yours that you may want to connect to. Today's webinar is being recorded, and it'll be on the Council's website within a few days, along with, I think, a dozen others. So when you can't sleep at 2 in the morning, you can go and look at some of the past webinars. The vision of the Council for Power in the World's Religions is a more just, peaceful, and sustainable world. We hope the work will cultivate harmony among the world's religions and spiritual communities and foster their engagement with the critical issues of our time. We send our thanks to all of you who are doing your own part for a better world. Once again, on behalf of the Council, thank you so much for joining us today.